Public awareness and community mobilization to address domestic violence in older women. This learning module focuses on the public education campaign, It's Not Right, Neighbors, Friends, and Families for Older Adults, which promotes public awareness and community mobilization around the issue of abuse and neglect of older adults, which includes domestic violence. This campaign promotes awareness and builds skills with bystanders to support older women who may be experiencing violence. This module contains 4 learning objectives. 1. Become familiar with the public education and awareness campaign, It's Not Right, Neighbors, Friends, and Families for Older Adults. 2. Recognize the warning signs and risk factors associated with domestic violence in older couples. 3. Understand domestic violence within older relationships is a complex issue with various individual and structural barriers to seeking help. 4. Identify strategies for responding safely and effectively to violence in older couples as neighbors, friends, and family members. When necessary, you may pause and start this video or refer to linked resources in the description box for further information as they appear. To open the description box, simply click on Show More below the video. At the end of the module, click the link below to be directed to a certificate of completion. The full biography of our presenter, Margaret MacPherson, is available below. Now let's get started. Our first learning objective is to become familiar with the public education and awareness campaign, It's Not Right, Neighbors, Friends, and Families for Older Adults.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about It's Not Right, Neighbors, Friends, and Families for Older Adults, which is the public education campaign for the Domestic Violence Action Plan here in Ontario. Everything that comes from Neighbors, Friends, and Families grows from findings found in the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, who found very early in reviewing domestic homicides that it's the neighbors, friends, and family members who are most likely to be aware of what's happening, but who don't know what to do about it. And so Neighbors, Friends, and Families was developed with a sort of an expert advisory panel who sat together for many months and created resources. And from that time, it was launched in 2005 to the present, it's grown and spread into other areas. So there's Neighbors, Friends, and Families. It's a community program. Make It Our Business, which is a workplace domestic violence campaign. And then, of course, there's It's Not Right, Neighbors, Friends, and Families for Older Adults. And so we're working from basic ideas about how do you prepare people? You know, what are we going to do? How are we going to teach people? So these are the few things that we're working on. So these are brochures that were created. I think they represent the best thinking in the country around the public education because we had so many people involved in the conversations in every province and territory. And the stories that came forward were the same, similar sort of wherever we were. And so we are working at the, sort of this idea about changing social norms, addressing directly the idea, that we mind your own business, what goes on in a home is private. The problem's too big, there's nothing we can do about it. And of course, the idea that aging diminishes your value. It is a bystander approach in which we talk about everybody having a role to play. And I know that it's that idea, everyone has a role to play, is kind of an empty idea unless you actually tell people what it is that you want them to do. So part of what we're doing is being very specific about what's the action we want you to take. And we want people to really understand that small actions do make a difference and that they can contribute to creating a society, in an everyday kind of way. Okay, let's use the tools that we have to teach everyone to recognize warning signs and risk factors no matter where they are.
Warning signs are red flags that can alert neighbors, friends, and family members that abuse may be taking place.
how to respond safely and effectively, and how to refer and find help in the places in which they find themselves. This goes to the idea of social complexity, that the way to address very complex social issues, if you can get people if you can teach 1, 2, or 3 sort of basic things that everybody starts to do, it will fundamentally change the issue.
In order to address domestic violence in older adults, we must first be able to recognize warning signs and relevant risk factors.
Though I want to talk a little bit about domestic violence. How is it different in older couples? So this is from the DVDRC, and it just reiterates some of what's been said, right? That we know that domestic violence decreases sort of in frequency, as far as we know, in older adults, but in older couples, but it's still present, it's still an issue. And older women have very different experiences of domestic violence.
According to Statistics Canada, older women are also more likely to be victims of domestic violence than older men. In 2010, the rate of victimization for domestic violence was more than double in older women in comparison to older men. Structural discrimination based on age and other characteristics such as socioeconomic status, race, and ability may exacerbate violence against older women. Furthermore, domestic violence can also occur across the life course in relationships with gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender individuals.
So this is another ageist expression, right, that we don't know a lot about domestic violence in older couples because the research hasn't been done. We know, though, that they're most likely to be in intact marriages. Husbands are the large majority of perpetrators. There's physical health problems in common, depression with the perpetrator, dementia with the victim is things we're seeing. And we also know that it looks differently in older couples.
More than 6 in 10 older adult victims of family-related homicides between 2006 and 2016 were women.
So I just want to reference this report. This was the 2014 report that sent off shockwaves, really, I think, across the country. I was working with the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse at the time. We were meeting sort of monthly or on the teleconferences. And when this report came out, there were 4 cases of domestic homicide, suicide in it, and in older couples. And 2 of them were long histories of domestic violence that had, sort of escalated to homicide, suicide. But there were 2 cases where there were no sort of real signs of domestic violence. It was not really the nature of that relationship, but they were a couple who were experiencing diminishing health capacities, who got to a point where they felt so isolated that homicide, suicide seemed like the solution for them. So for the Canadian Network, it really did, as somebody said, talked about the canary in the mine shaft. We're going to start seeing more of this. So this is a couple of slides that I have where we're looking at homicide, the difference between sort of the age groups in homicide and homicide-suicide rates. And what you see is that in the older couples, the homicide-suicide rates are much higher. And in the risk factors, depression of the perpetrator is very dominant there. That, and also, of course, the history of domestic violence.
Although there are also other risk factors for domestic violence across all age groups, many of these risk factors are less likely to be present in the relationships of older adult couples. Thus, older adults should be examined as a unique population when assessing risk for domestic violence.
So we produced 10 scenarios. I think about it as a smorgasbord of tools, actually, that can be assembled in a variety of ways. We're working with them in a particular way right now in Ontario that I'll talk about toward the end. But this is the scenario that we call the visit. And so this is a scene I'm going to show with the daughter is visiting the parents and the brother is coming to pick up his sister. And we always instruct people to just watch for the things that, the warning signs, the things that make you feel uncomfortable.
As you watch the video clip, consider, what are some of the warning signs for domestic violence?
Hey, Mom.
I'm waiting.
Oh, I'm coming. Your father's always been so particular about his tea.
You gonna invite them in this time? Or are they just gonna stand out there with their coats on like a couple of strangers?
The old man's as tearful as usual, it seems.
I told her we couldn't stay. I've already had about all I can take.
Oh, it's a new record for you.
I'm trying to beat yours.
Oh, it's so good to see you both.
I don't know why you still let him talk to you like that. You should have left him years ago.
Oh, she's stronger than that, aren't you, Mom?
Are you sure you can't stay? I can make you something to eat.
They wanna go? Let them go. Good for nothings. The three of you. Ah!
Oh, Christ.
Could you have made it any fuller? What's wrong with you?
Ow! Oh, I'm sorry.
We literally just stopped by to say hello. We have to run.
Well, don't wait so long between visits. We never see you.
Well, you know, life happens, you know? That was fun.
Still want to get that drink?
Oh, yeah.
Skies today with brisk easterly winds. Expect a high near 52 degrees.
Now let's take a moment to further reflect on this scene. Is it domestic violence? If it is domestic violence, what warning signs did you see? What risk factors did you see? Feel free to pause the video and participate in this exercise. Click play when you are ready, and Ms. MacPherson will further discuss the implications of this scene.
So all of the scenarios were produced with lots of input. They all tell these kinds of stories that people find to be so familiar. We don't look to the adult children as the bystanders to intervene in this situation. They're part of the family dynamic. And we unpack with audiences sort of, you know, what are the warning signs, what are the risk factors, and what are the sort of the larger forces that are at work here. We talk a lot about power and how power works because it's so important when we're talking about domestic violence to engage people in thinking about the many different forces that are at work that reduce people down to, you know, a state of powerlessness. And so in this particular situation, you know, we're looking at a history of domestic violence. His health is failing. He's becoming more dependent. If she hurts him as retribution for years of abuse, is it any less of a concern? And as he loses his independence, the abusive behavior may escalate. You can see sort of he appears to be very angry. Her challenges, right? Power and controls normalize. This is a long-standing relationship, and she's kind of trapped by his deteriorating health and increasing dependency. There's a real expectation, right, that she's the one that will care for him.
Poor health may contribute to violence in older adult relationships. Perpetrators may exhibit violence as a symptom of existing medical complications, or may use their health as an excuse for violent behavior.
I expect she feels shame. The children are distant and unavailable. And so does she know what supports are available? And if she did decide to leave, like this is a growing conversation I find in the shelter world about how to accommodate older women and what will happen to her husband if she does, if she were to decide to leave. They're, at the end of that scene, you see they're pretty isolated, and sort of what you can see in the future for them is not, it's not good without some kind of intervention. And so beginning to imagine what the interventions might look like on the ground is part of the discussions that we have.
In order to address domestic violence in older couples, it is crucial that we understand that domestic violence within older relationships is a complex issue with various individual and structural barriers to seeking help.
There's lots of barriers, right, to seeking help. The ageist, I was surprised when I started working in this sector and people said domestic violence is kind of marginalized in the world of elder abuse. We don't take it as seriously. And you'll hear the phrase domestic violence grown old, as if that's a reason not to take it as seriously. I was quite surprised to hear that because I come from sort of the violence against women sector. So for me, crossing over and working in elder abuse was absolutely fascinating because I could see sort of the differences and how the sectors operate. I would go to, the very first, my colleague Barb McCory and I went to a national conference, and it was like a whole other room of people we'd never seen, of healthcare providers who we never see at a VAW conference. It was quite interesting. And so we think this is an opportunity to kind of connect dots and bring people together and to think about how these things overlap. And so we're quite intentional about inserting domestic violence content into the elder abuse presentations, all of them. So you can see there's lots of barriers there, that sort of keep these people stuck.
Lack of available supports is also a significant barrier to help seeking. Older women with limited to no support from their friends and family, including their children, may have low willingness to seek help. Furthermore, health providers may fail to ask older women about violence in their relationships, or may fail to provide older women with resources even when they are aware of ongoing abuse.
And I do think it's really important to situate all of these in in an ecological model where we are moving away from looking at violence as an individual issue to, sort of all the different layers and all the different forces at work. And, this is important because if we stay stuck at the individual level, inevitably the conversation goes to how Pat's allowing the situation to happen and kind of the whole victim blaming thing that we end up talking about, and that Phil must be a bad person. And it's such a simplistic read on the complexity of these relationships that I think that we have to take every opportunity to help people understand the larger forces that are happening in people's lives that cast them into these places of having more and less power. So, sometimes I say to people, I really want to overwhelm you with the complexity of the issue so that we stop thinking about simple solutions and we join sort of forces in trying to work through things in a way that respects the complexity of people's lives and circumstances and allows us to do things that are actually really effective. This is a quote from Charmaine Spencer. She was part of the original network group that advised on It's Not Right. And I just think she's done a lot of really important work around social isolation and ageism, and I just wanted to give her a nod because I think this is an important quote. People don't recognize the ways in which we're all implicated. And so part of what we do in the training sessions is to do that, is to implicate everyone, to say there's no pure place to stand and say, I don't have ageist attitudes. We're all implicated in this, and so if you can't be part of the solution if you're not part of the problem. And I think that there's a number of ways that we can do this, working with stories like The Visit, to help people understand the ways in which we're complicit in maintaining the status quo.
As a society, we seldom think to question the basis of our attitudes and beliefs. People simply incorporate the societal norms and values into their own way of thinking about and behaving towards older adults. In this same report, Ms. Spencer goes on to say, ageism is also the structural framework within a particular society that can facilitate the devaluation of older adults as full citizens, create or perpetuate their marginalization individually or as a group, and their exclusion.
And so, you know, the bigger picture here, always there's ageism around, you know, sort of all the forces that are happening around keeping them together and, you know, sort of marginalizing the fact that she's in an abusive relationship and has been for a long time. And so somehow or other that is her fault. And so some of the larger forces, you know, is a deteriorating health situation. The economic pressures that don't allow them to really have supports in place, increasing sort of isolation that's happening to families in deteriorating situations. All of the social expectations that she will in fact be the one to look after him. And, you know, the shifting power dynamics as he becomes more dependent on her and what that means. So, you know, it's complicated, right? And I think it's also, I've said, I'm not talking anywhere anymore that I don't reference unregulated capitalism as really being the problem that we're talking about. But I do think that we need to be connecting the dots to, you know, sort of the larger economic picture that boxes us in. Because what happens is it translates down to people fighting for scraps at the bottom of the pile, and we deserve so much better, so much more than that. And I'd like to start, you know, find the places where we could start to talk about social return on investments, because, you know, I read the Auditor General's report on violence against women, and there's nothing in there about outcomes for women, right? It's all about business outcomes. So, you know, where are the social returns on the investments we're making? This is a conversation I think we need to be really having. I think it's always really important to say that when we're talking about the larger forces that are at work, we're never excusing the behavior, right? We're not making excuses for him. We want to hold people accountable for their behavior. But we do need to shift into a sort of a more trauma and violence-informed language and understanding about the complexity of family violence that understands that we're dealing with traumatized people at all levels of the system, and that hurt people hurt people. So yes, accountability, and we need to be more effective. You know, we can't vote them all off the planet. And so we need to find ways to work more effectively with people who are using violence in their relationships to reclaim them from violence and to restore sort of families and communities in, you know, wherever that is possible.
If we can learn to recognize warning signs and risk factors, we can identify strategies for responding safely and effectively to violence in older couples as neighbors, friends, and family members.
So this is, I'm just going to show you the response to the scenario I showed you. This is, you know, the research is clear that you have to actually show people what you want them to do. There's another scenario, a little clip that shows what we don't want him to do, but this is Pat's friend, and so I'll just have you watch. And it's always about watching for the impact that he has.
In the next scene, watch for the impact on Pat when her friend sees the situation, names the abuse, and offers to support her.
You know how the kids are. Always got one foot out the door.
That's understandable. He's been abusive to all of you for years. It's not your fault, Pat. I mean, lots of families have to deal with this stuff. It's not uncommon. But you can do something about it.
I'm too old to start changing the way things are.
You're not too old, Pat. You're a strong woman. Just decide what you want to do. And I'll tell you something. I'll be here for you no matter what.
Now let's take a moment to further reflect on this scene. How did Pat respond to her friend's advice? Do you think the friend was able to open the door to support for Pat? Feel free to pause the video and participate in this exercise. Click play when you are ready, and Ms. MacPherson will further discuss the implications of this scene.
So this is the message that we want people to have, that we're not asking them to solve the problem, we're not asking them to fix the situation. We're suggesting that by recognizing, seeing what's happening to people, naming the thing that they're seeing, and then asking questions leaving it with them to decide, you know, I'm here for you, that's meaningful. It's not going to solve everything, but it's meaningful in particular circumstances. And so we're trading on existing relationships. And it doesn't matter how much you know about the issue. When violence and abuse happens to someone you know, you're going to struggle like everybody else. It's a leveler. It puts us all on the same footing. And so, you know, we have a conversation framework that we call Think It, See It, Name It, Check It, that he's just kind of modeled. I see what's happened. I'm concerned about you. Is there anything I can do? Do you want to talk about it? I'm here for you. That is in itself a response, right? That things can happen from, and that it leaves it with her to decide the what's next. So the implications, you know, are that, you know, these are just a few things that we've talked about, right? Unique risk assessment and risk management are needed for older adults. The relationship between suicide, the risk of suicide and the risk for domestic homicide, I don't know that we've ever really sort of thought about these things together. Key issues without the DV history are physical and mental illness in the victim and the perpetrator, so I think we need to be connecting those dots. And always, you know, the need for public education and people working together, especially those working with older adults. So these are my questions. How does risk change when health forces one partner to be the caregiver to the other? And, you know, sort of in both situations where the historical abuser is the caregiver and when the victim is the caregiver. How prepared are healthcare workers to recognize and respond to domestic violence? I was at the hospital a few weeks ago, and a young woman asked me if I'd ever experienced violence, which was a great question. But I said, if I say yes to you, what will happen next? And she was clearly uncomfortable with the question, and she wouldn't look at me while she was asking the question. And so, you know, it's like the sort of the structural pieces that we put into place are important, but without sort of the on-the-ground work that really brings it to life, they sit as sort of lofty ideals, I'm afraid. How do we recognize high risk for older adults? And this, for me, is always the most interesting question. How are we going to work across the sectors, right? Because, you know, I see there's so much knowledge and experience sitting in different places. It's connecting the dots, which means that we have to put more value on the places where people intersect and in sort of local places where the work is happening. How do we enable that? How do we support it?
There are several important messages that arise from Ms. MacPherson's presentation. These include 1. Making the public aware of domestic violence in older couples is critical to preventing violence against older women. 2. Public education and awareness campaigns can be used to mobilize community members to recognize and respond to domestic violence in older couples. 3. Addressing the problem of domestic violence against older women requires consideration of the individual and structural barriers to seeking help. Thank you for completing the learning module, Public Awareness and Community Mobilization for Addressing Domestic Violence in Older Women. Click the link below to be directed to a short survey and a certificate of completion.